Normally we're good.
Okay, thank you very much. And so we're very pleased to welcome in this first seminar in the History of Ideas and History of Knowledge research seminar that we have set up with Emmanuel Dechamps, Lissel Quiros, Yann Giraud, and myself at the AGORA Research Center of CY Cergy Paris Université. And this is the first ever of those seminars, and so therefore we are extremely honored to have Chandran Kukathas to come and talk about his book, his new book on immigration and freedom. And here is the book, yeah, with a wonderful cover. So they'd say don't judge a book by its cover, but in this case, I would say that it's a fine cover of Marc Chagall's America Windows of 1977, which I thought was particularly beautiful. So Professor Chandran Kukathas is Dean and Professor of Political Science at the School of Social Sciences at Singapore Management University. And he was from 2015 to 2019 head of the Department of Government at the LSE. He has held many positions in many universities of the world, and I think this is something we will also discuss because he's a sort of global citizen of the world. And you mostly know him for his contributions to multiculturalism and especially to the understanding of Hayek's political philosophy. He's the author of several books, but I would especially mention The Liberal Archipelago, A Theory of Diversity and Freedom, which was published with Oxford University Press in 2003, and also with Oxford University Press in 1989, the famous Hayek and Modern Liberalism that I had to study as a student at the Sorbonne, which brings me back a long time. And so to discuss it, we are also delighted to welcome Professor David Owen, who is Professor of Social and Political Philosophy at the University of Southampton, and who is particularly well placed to discuss Chandran's book, as he has also just published a book with Polity in 2020 entitled What Do We Owe to Refugees? David is also the author of a number of books. I will only mention today Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality, published in 2007, which with Acumen. So today we are here to discuss Chandran's new book, which came out with Princeton University Press this year, entitled Immigration and Freedom. And we are here to see together in what ways controlling immigration means imposing restrictions upon natives. And I think that this question is particularly prescient in the debate which is taking place at the moment in Britain over, the lack of labor and the problems related to Brexit, but it is also extremely prescient in our French presidential election campaign, which will take place, which is in the process of starting, and the election will take place next year. And of course, the question of immigration is one of the key questions at the moment. And so we are particularly pleased to have Chandran and David in discussion with this. The way things are going to go is that Professor Chandran Kukathas will start with between 30 and 40 minutes presenting the main aspects of his book. And then Professor David Owen will carry on discussing it up to 16 minutes. And then we'll have enough time altogether to try and have questions and answers. And normally we have to finish on time, but because I started 5 minutes late, we'll take 5 minutes more. So around, I'd say, 4:05. Right, and so without further ado, I'd like to first of all thank Chandran. Thank you. And I leave him the floor in order for him to start.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you everyone for coming and for hosting me and giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts about my book. I won't try to present the book as a whole, although what I'll be saying will track the arguments of the book reasonably closely, but it's a long book and this is a short presentation. So what I really want to do is draw out a few key philosophical topics, although I will also draw quite a lot on empirical material, because while this is a philosophical book, I wrote it also with a view to trying to understand immigration, not as an abstract idea, but as an institutional reality. And some of the examples I'll supply will, I think, bring this home. So I want to start by saying that my topic today is immigration and freedom, and my purpose in writing this book was to put immigration at the center of discussion of immigration. Most of the time, I think, when we see immigration debated, it's really because people are concerned about the labor market. They're worried about the economic consequences of the movement of people across borders. And of course, this is an important topic, and I will, at some point, touch upon it. But that's not my main concern. In fact, it's not even the concern with whether or not states have the right to exclude people from immigrating, or whether other people have the right to move, which is also a dominant theme in the literature on immigration, at least within political philosophy. These are the questions that people ask, and I want to put these aside. Although I'm speaking about freedom, I should also mention that I'm not going to present a defense of the idea of open borders, even though it is a part of my thesis that immigration controls infringe individual freedom. There is an argument to be made for open borders. Many people have made it, but I won't be making it here, although I imagine that many of the questions that will come up later on will relate to this question. But let me say at the outset that that's not what I'm going to articulate or propose or defend, although I'll be surprised if people don't read me in this way. And I think the reason for that is because of the fundamental thesis I want to advance, and that is the thesis that immigration controls are controls not only on immigrants or would-be immigrants, but also controls upon people more generally and upon the people at a potential immigrant receiving society. The host society is no less subject to control as a result of attempts to control immigration than are would-be immigrants themselves. In fact, in some ways, those who are excluded are less subject to control, have fewer of their freedoms lost or diminished than those who remain inside a society. And this is what I want to explore. I want to explore this idea that immigration control is something that we should be worried about or concerned about as much as we are concerned about immigration itself, perhaps even more so. Now, why do I say this? Why do I think that immigration controls are controls not only on outsiders, but also on insiders? Well, one way to begin thinking about this is simply to recognize the fact that most immigration controls aren't, in fact, controls on movement, although there are controls on movement. There are borders, there are visas to be obtained in order to travel, and so on. But immigration control for many countries of the world is not really about keeping people out or controlling the movement. Most governments, in fact, want people to cross the border. They want people to come in. North Korea may be an exception, but it is a rarity. Britain and the United States and Australia and Singapore boast of the number of people who come in, mostly as tourists, but also to play football, to do any of a host of other things. What they don't want people doing is settling, taking a job without authorization, enrolling in a university, perhaps getting married, buying property, doing any one of a number of things which would otherwise be legal if they had a certain status, if they were citizens, if they were residents, if they had the right visa, and so on. But the problem for states wanting to control outsiders in this way is that people within a society are always all too ready to associate with people, whether they're insiders or outsiders, whether they're residents or visitors. They're ready to trade with them, to employ them, to hire them for one purpose or another, to admit them to a university, to help them set up business, maybe even to marry them, to rent to them, and so on. So in order to control immigration, what you've got to control is not just border crossings. What you've got to control is the relationships that might develop between your fellow citizens, your fellow residents, and outsiders, which means that you've got to distinguish insiders from outsiders. And this is where I think control looks like it begins. It doesn't begin at the border, it begins further in from the borders that demarcate the modern state. But actually, even that may be diminishing the significance of something else, which I think is no less neglected in discussions of immigration. And that is that all of this presupposes that there are two obvious or natural or easily distinguishable categories, the categories of the insider and the outsider, the category of the national and the immigrant or would-be immigrant. But one thing I'd like to point out is that this, in fact, is not something that's obvious. And if one takes a little bit of a look at history, it very quickly becomes apparent that many people become nationals or citizens, having started off as immigrants, and many people also lose their citizenship or nationality reluctantly or unwillingly or or forcibly, depending on the circumstances. Who is and is not a national is the other side of the question of who is and is not potentially or actually an immigrant. Let me give you one particular example of this, and although it's now getting a little bit remote in history, it's not that long ago, it's certainly within my lifetime. And this is the case of the British Empire. Now, the British Empire spanned quite a bit of the globe for most of the 20th century. But in the 1950s, various countries started to, particularly in Asia and Africa, become independent. Up until this time, all the residents of these countries, Ghana, Malaysia, or Malaya, where I was born, Australia, which received its independence, if you want to call it that, in 1901, Singapore, a whole host of countries became independent, and in the course of this, they lost their British nationality. But before this, they were in fact British nationals. In fact, even after independence, most of these people retained their British nationality. Many of them started to have it diminished after the promulgation of the British Citizenship Act in 1948, but before then they were recognized as British subjects and they were loyal to Britain. The Prime Minister of Australia famously said after Britain declared war on Germany in 1939 that Britain was at war, therefore Australia was at war. Well, the same was true for many of these other countries. But slowly, between about 1948 and 1970, people from these countries were stripped of their British nationality. If you read Franzman's British nationality law, a tome of about 2,000 pages, you'll see tracked all the different changes. And not everybody wanted or was happy about losing this citizenship, nor was everyone in Britain happy about this. Many parliamentarians on both sides of the House, people on the Labour side as well as the Conservative side, said this was not right because these people were British. So this raises a very interesting question. What is it to be a member of a particular nationality? Now, I've given you the British case, but the same is true in the United States. It's even true in France. There are cases of people who've lost their nationality because it's been found that sometime in the past they had done something not illegal or had failed to do something, which now means that they will be stripped of their nationality. In the book, I cite the case of a Mr. Sekou Kamara from Senegal, who came to France and became a citizen when he was 20, and then found that he was not eligible until he was 21 to become a French citizen, so he lost it. In the United States, in the early part of the 20th century, if a woman married a non-American, she lost her American citizenship and ceased to be American. So the first step in deciding how to control immigration is in fact not border control, it's really classification. You decide who counts and who does not count as a citizen or as a national. And of course, many people have dual nationalities, but countries have very different rules about who counts as a potential holder of dual nationality. India, for example, does not permit Pakistanis to hold dual nationality. Neither does Pakistan permit Indians to hold Pakistani nationality. But various other countries can hold dual nationality with Pakistan. So the point I want to make here is that this system of classification is really where immigration control begins. And it begins here because you need to decide who counts as the host, who has the right to let people in. Now, that said, let's put that aside for the moment and assume that this is not a continuing problem, although it is. And it's such a significant problem that we can recognize that even today, about 4,000 Americans are wrongfully deported every year because of confusions about their actual nationality. In smaller numbers, the same is true in Britain, the same is true in Australia and in many countries around the world. The classification is often complex and contested. But let me go back to my earlier point. The thing we need to be more concerned about than we've recognized, I think, so far, is the extent to which these controls that attempt to manage immigration actually impinge significantly, not just on outsiders, but also on insiders. Part of this happens because of the problem of classification. Between 1930 and the year 2000, the United States mistakenly deported 1 million of its own citizens, most of them Mexicans, because they could not establish that they were in fact American, even though many of them had been in the United States since the 19th century. They were descendants of people who were incorporated in the United States. So the fact that classification is complex continues to be a problem, but it continues to be a problem not just for those who are excluded, but also for those who are in danger of being excluded. But let me elaborate a little bit more on other respects in which immigration control redounds upon the people who are resident in a country and are citizens of a country. I mentioned earlier that one of the things that immigration control requires is control of citizens and residents, because the point of immigration control is in fact to try to prevent people from interacting in particular ways more than it is about trying to prevent people just crossing the border. What are the different ways in which this takes place? And once we've looked at this, we might then ask the important question of why this matters, and subsequently the question of whether there's a justification for it nonetheless. Well, the first thing to observe is that if you're going to control the ways in which outsiders conduct themselves once they enter a society, whether they enter the labor force, whether they try to enroll in universities, whether they try to open bank accounts and so on, is that you have to control those people and those institutions within your own society. People at universities are very familiar with this because universities now are under significant pressure to make sure that they report to the Home Office in the case of Britain, to various immigration authorities in the case of other countries, that they are in fact abiding by the regulations with respect to students, that they are genuine students and so on. This has imposed a significant burden on some universities. At worst, for a university like London Metropolitan, it was actually closed down for a while and then denied permission to have overseas students because the government wasn't happy with its monitoring of admissions. This is a costly process for all universities. But if you think of every employer will have to conform to or comply with regulations which limit the employer's capacity to recruit, to hire, and so on. David Cameron famously said that what we want to do, when he wanted to control immigration to the United Kingdom, especially with respect to those coming in from Calais, is that we're going to strengthen the internal borders. We're going to make it harder for immigrants to get a license, to open a bank account, to rent a property. And so Britain did all those things, but it made it more difficult for British citizens to rent a property, for landlords to be compliant with regulations, for ordinary citizens to open bank accounts. Speaking personally, as a warden of a college in the UK for many years, it was difficult to get students to just come onto various committees like the Treasury because they had trouble opening bank accounts because they were foreign nationals. By the time they could open an account, it was a bit too late for them to take up official positions. These are all trivial examples, but if you see this multiplied, you can see that it starts to get a little bit more complicated. Let me give you a slightly different kind of example, though, of the kind of way in which immigration control impinges upon the lives and livelihoods of people living within a society. Consider the fact that if you're someone who has a relationship with a foreign person, let's say you get married, have children, and so on, in order to return to the United Kingdom, you have to be sponsored by your partner in order to enter the United Kingdom. In order to do that, you have to apply to the Home Office to sponsor your partner, whether husband or wife. But you're only eligible to do this if you meet the minimum requirements in terms of income. You need to be making at least £18,000 a year. If you don't, well, you're not eligible to bring your husband or wife back. Well, as it turns out, the impact of this is that every year about 20,000 Britons cannot bring their partners back to the United Kingdom. These are people who are British citizens, but cannot reunite with their spouses. They can leave, even if their spouses actually are quite wealthy. There was a case of a woman who went to Brazil, married a Brazilian doctor, returned with their child, applied to bring him back to the United Kingdom, but was refused permission on the grounds that although he was quite wealthy as a doctor, she did not meet the income threshold. Now, again, this is just one example, but actually, no, it's one of 20,000 examples every year. Multiply that by 10 years. You have 200,000 Britons who are unable to live in a way that we would just take for granted. Now, of course, one could say that surely these things could be fixed, and of course they should be fixed. But the point I'm trying to make here is simply that this is one of a multiplicity of ways in which the freedom of citizens, of residents, is infringed by the fact of immigration control. In fact, what immigration control requires is a level of surveillance of the citizenry in order to ensure compliance. And as the imperative to ensure control of immigration, particularly if the concern is with the numbers of people who are entering the country, my concern is that the greater the imperative to control immigration, the greater will be the extent of intrusion into the lives of citizens and residents. This is whether they're employers or landlords, or simply people looking to live their lives, not in ways that involves employing immigrants, but simply because they formed relationships across borders. And this is something that takes place all the time. The other thing that might also be worth pointing out at this stage is that it's important to note that this kind of expansion of the powers of the state and the intrusions of the state don't simply find themselves restricted to the interior of the state. once immigration control becomes an important imperative, most states recognize that they need to address the problem, not just at the borderline level, but within the borders and also beyond the borders. So in the EU, for example, police have powers to stop people within 40 or 50 kilometers of the borders of the EU. Within the United States, within 100 miles of the Mexican border, police have stop and search powers that aren't subject to constitutional control if the issue is immigration. In numerous parts of the world, border control is something that exists well within the border, but also it exists beyond the borders because powerful states and organizations or institutions like the European Union send their operatives to other parts of the world. The former head of the White House staff under Donald Trump, General Kelly, when he was a general and involved in issues of national security, observed quite candidly that as far as the United States is concerned, the homeland is the planet. And if our security is concerned, then we need to be concerned with what goes on everywhere in the world. And when it comes to border control, it says the control of the southern border starts in Peru, because we send people down there to help governments there manage the outflow of immigration. Now, again, I think this is something that citizens ought to be concerned about, because they need to ask the question, what is it that governments are being authorized to do in their name, in the name of immigration control? Now, all that said, the obvious question to ask is, well, perhaps it's all worth it nonetheless, because there are important gains to be made by controlling immigration. Immigration control is, alas, simply a necessity. We need to control immigration because we need to protect our citizens from competition in the labor market. We need to ensure a certain kind of cultural integrity, which would be lost if we were suddenly to find that there was a massive inflow of immigrants who would transform the cultural character of the society. And also we need to just recognize that we must remain in control of our own destiny as a single people. We need to be self-determining. And this in itself means we need to give serious thought to immigration control, to the question of how we're going to manage immigration. So let me consider each of these concerns in turn, beginning very briefly with the economic arguments. Here the arguments are, I think, of two kinds. One is essentially an argument about the impact of immigration on the overall wealth of a society. People who see the nation state as a kind of club with benefits to share are worried that the benefits will be distributed too thinly if too many people join. And then there's also a distributive concern. There are people who worry that if we have too much immigration, the people who will suffer most are the poorest members of society, even if immigration brings benefits, because those benefits tend to advantage the rich and advantage them disproportionately. So let's consider each of these two questions. Let me begin with the first point, that immigration threatens to impoverish a society. I think this would be an important concern if there was any great merit to the empirical claim. But here I'm simply going to report that the vast majority of studies have simply concluded that in the short, medium, and long term, immigration is simply advantageous to societies because it means, as far as the economy is concerned, a more advantageous distribution of talents and skills to where they're most desired and most beneficial. This is true globally to an even greater extent. But even if one were just to look at the economy of a host society, in the end, a rising tide lifts all boats, if I can just use a cliche. Overall wealth will increase, but also there are other things that immigrants bring which improve the quality of life, economically speaking, in interesting ways. Immigrants tend on the whole to be more entrepreneurial. Most successful enterprises seem to be created by immigrants, even more so by those who come poor. There's a disproportionate number of enterprises that are created and become successful that are created by refugees, for example. All the evidence points to growing economic benefits that come from immigration, at least as far as the overall wealth of a country is concerned. But that doesn't answer the other more difficult question, which is what happens to those who are the worst off in the society? What happens to those at the bottom end of the labor market? And there is some truth to the claim that there is a lot of competition at the lower end of the market for labor. So workers who are on the minimum wage are more likely to encounter competition from would-be immigrants. What does one say to that? I think part of the answer to this is that, yes, there will be some consequences for the worst off. There are two categories of people generally that fare worst in the labor market when it comes to competition with immigrants. One category is the previous generation of immigrants. They are the ones who will find themselves most in competition with new immigrants. And then secondly, there are those who don't complete high school. So the question one has to ask here, well, I think there are two questions. Of the previous generation of immigrants, I think it's probably fair to ask whether they should be concerned about their own welfare when they were themselves immigrants who took advantage of these opportunities. But to those who are on the bottom end of the scale in terms of wealth and income, I think we can also say a couple of things. One is that this is not a permanent condition. It's a temporary condition when you are going to be facing more competition. The other is that while some of you in this category will do worse for competition with immigrants, others will do better, for the simple reason that when immigrants come into a country, some of them come as people whose labor is a substitute for existing labor, and others come in as immigrants whose labor is complementary. Those whose labor is complementary create jobs, even as those whose labor is a substitute compete for jobs. Most people actually are a mixture of these two things. So if you were to try to reduce immigration or prevent certain categories of people from immigrating, you would definitely bring some benefit to some of your poorer fellow citizens, but you will also disadvantage some of your other poorer fellow citizens. In the long run, everybody will be better off, but in the short run, you will be benefiting some at the expense of others. What's not clear is why this is regarded as a worthwhile strategy. That is to say, to harm only those who would benefit from immigrants, but not harm those who would not benefit from immigrants. After all, they're both equally nationals. And there is another thing that I think that also is worth asking. If the concern ultimately is to protect the poorest of your fellow nationals, and we accept that in the long term, immigration actually increases wealth, well, this means in the next generation, the poorest will be better off. but immigration control threatens to make them poorer off than they would be otherwise. Why do you want to protect your current generation of poor at the expense of the next generation of poor? I'm not saying that there couldn't be an answer to this, but I think it's a question that needs to be answered in making the case that the price of immigration control is worth paying because of the economic advantages. Well, what about the argument that immigration control is needed to protect our cultural integrity? I can see this argument being one that might be an important one for some countries which are extremely homogeneous. In those cases, the influx of a large number of people with very different traditions and customs might be extremely disruptive. But I think there are very few countries like this. Tibet may be an example, although, of course, it's been overrun by a different tradition altogether. I leave that aside for that reason. But if we think about, let's say, countries of Europe or North America or parts of the world like Australia, where there is already a considerable amount of diversity, of heterogeneity, where there are people living side by side despite having different religions, different ethnicities, different cultural commitments, and so on. Why is immigration control a problem here? Well, here actually there's a kind of a dilemma that faces people who want to make this argument. If the claim is that, well, in countries like, let's say, Britain, for example, there is a national culture, there is a British identity, that there is a culture that's worth protecting, but it's capacious and it encompasses a great many people, from Punjabis and Sikhs to Chinese and Romanians, from Catholics to Protestants to Muslims to Hindus. Fine. But if that's the case, if it is in fact that heterogeneous, why is it a problem if people arrive from outside? Because the country is already diverse. That is the nature of its culture. On the other hand, if you said, no, actually the problem is that we do have a much more united culture than that, and the influx of people from other traditions would be disruptive to this, then what one has to do is come up with an account of what that culture is. What is the content of that culture? What does it mean to be an American or an Australian or a French person or a Brit? And here, as we know from the last several decades of the so-called culture wars, this is an extremely contentious question. If you made this a consideration when trying to manage immigration, you're going to have to say something about who counts as a proper Briton or a proper Australian. And here what you run the risk of doing is excluding your fellow citizens. And bear in mind that in many of the countries that I've mentioned, many of the people who've joined the country in order to make it what it is today were some of them voluntary immigrants, were many of them involuntary immigrants, and just as many, again, were people who were invited to immigrate or were never regarded as immigrants. If you think, for example, in Britain, of the Windrush generation, they were born British subjects. They were always British by Britain's own laws. So if you were to turn around now and say, well, no, we have a new, less inclusive definition of Britishness, you would have to contend with this problem. How do you find a basis for exclusion which doesn't exclude some of your own citizens? Okay. So I think that the cultural argument for immigration control faces a number of really tricky problems, which I go into in more detail in the book, but I'm going to pass over now in the interests of time. Let me then come to my last objection to immigration, coming from those who say it's worth controlling immigration nonetheless, despite the risks to the freedom of citizens. And this is because immigration control is an expression of our self-determination. We want to take back control of our own country. It's about sovereignty in some way, to use a different term. Here, the only thing I'm going to point out is that actually immigration control is not something that is unilaterally exercised by any country. Some countries have more control over it than others, but even they are subject to all kinds of restrictions because immigration control is in fact not a national endeavor, it is an international endeavor. It is governed, it is shaped by treaties, by international agreements, by international regimes. Once you sign up for immigration control, you actually sign up for an intergovernmental operation. In the EU, it means that much of your sovereignty is in fact given away, if you're French or German, to a larger organization, the European Union. Its boundaries are policed by agencies which don't answer directly to any particular country. But even if you're a country like Australia or the United States, you're still subject to a whole range of voluntarily agreed to treaties and regimes which shape and limit your capacity to control immigration. So if you really want to go it alone and take back sovereignty, you have to think a lot about many of the other things that you're going to have to do in order to achieve this. Now, there's much more that I could say about this particular topic, but I'm very conscious of the fact that time is moving on, and I'm sure David has many things to raise. So perhaps I'll just stop there and turn the floor over to him. So thank you very much for listening thus far.
Thank you, Chandran. Thank you very much. David, the floor is yours.
Thanks. If you can give me control, Catherine, I'll just try and share my screen. So somebody say if in a second this picture is appearing to you. Can you see a picture of a cartoon?
No, hang on. So how do we do this? Hang on, I should be allowed. Hang on. I don't know how to do this. I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it then. It's not a problem. I'll just describe the cartoon for you instead. So this is a cartoon from the Times in 1905. And what it shows is on the far left is Britannia standing. And she's speaking to a husband, wife, and their children who just got off a boat at one of the docks in England. And it may not be apparent to you if you saw it, but they're actually Eastern European Jews. And the tagline underneath this is Britannia, as tears go down her cheeks, and she's holding a copy of the Aliens Act, passed in 1905 in her hand, and she says, "I can no longer offer shelter to fugitives. England is not a free country." And I mention that simply to draw attention to the point that when people say that immigration controls are a crucial part of sovereignty, that's a pretty recent thought. If you go back to Victorian England and you sort of ask the question, how many people were refused entry into the UK during the reign of Queen Victoria, the answer is basically none, which is why all the anarchists and socialists and co ended up in London. And so contributed to the intellectual life of the UK. So, I mean, I think this is worth hearing. Chandran talks in the book about the way in which passport controls came in after the First World War, and the way in which, you know, it's developed since then up to today is kind of biometric controls. And one of the kind of key themes in the book is to make clear how much of what is taken for granted as kind of natural, necessary, or obligatory is in some sense a product of political choices that have been made primarily by elites over the last kind of century and a bit, basically century and a half. So, I mean, I think one of the contributions of the book is to serve as a kind of reminder of the fact that, you know, things have been otherwise, things can be otherwise. These are political choices, you know, from how we define nationality to what range of migrant civic statuses we have, to how we cut them up, to how we specify them. You know, these are political choices that, you know, our states, or if you like, the government of our states makes. And that's kind of important contribution just by itself, because so much of that easily falls into the background and becomes taken for granted and, you know, as it were, not itself reflected on. But this kind of, there is a sort of issue with Chandran's book. There are a couple which I'll come to, but the first one is actually to ask the question, well, what kind of book is this, right? Because if you are aware of the normative literature on philosophy of migration, as I spend a lot of my time reading, this book, you know, does not fit well into the standard, you know, stream. It isn't concerned with, like, say, Joe Cairns' Ethics of Immigration, saying, you know, what immigration policies should a liberal constitutional democracy, you know, exhibit. It's not in the job of saying, well, you know, who is a refugee, and, you know, and what obligations do we owe to them? It's not even in the job of making an argument for open borders, however attractive that might be to Chandran given some of his other commitments. So it's a kind of interesting book. And when I, a long time ago, was reading the manuscript for Oxford, I ended up saying that this is almost like a spiritual book, that it's kind of like a meditation on the relation of immigration and freedom, except of course you'd have to have a category of funny meditations, because it's also really quite funny at times. So if there is a category of meditations with humor, then this kind of book falls into it. Now, that kind of matters, because if you ask what Chandran is trying to do, as it were, to and with the reader in this book, it strikes me that what he's really trying to do is not to, you know, tell people what are justified policies to pursue or anything of that kind. He's actually trying to cultivate a disposition. The point of the book is to, as it were, bring to kind of reflective awareness and cultivate a kind of, you know, in a kind of vivid awareness of our freedom and the ways in which it can be eroded, the ways in which, even as we don't notice, as, you know, the taken for background stuff operates, you know, in the background, the ways in which in which opportunities and what we take to be the range of opportunity available to us are kind of closed down. So it's a kind of wake-up book, which is, in a sense, reader, take your freedom more seriously. You know, pay attention to this, because we're not seeing it. So that, I think, leads to a really good and acute and subtle exploration of the different dimensions and ways in which freedom can be eroded. And the sort of emphasis on the kind of spirit of freedom, the subjective side of freedom. But that also, I think, kind of raises a kind of question for Chandran. So this would be the first, if you like, question that I pose, which is, given that Chandran is kind of rejecting, as it were, a theory of freedom, Chandran wants to speak to, as it were, the sort of what Jean-Luc Nancy would call the experience of freedom. Okay, I'm not saying that Chandran is giving the same kind of account as Jean-Luc Nancy would give, but it's about the experience of freedom and the practice of freedom. I mean, he quotes near the end Foucault saying, "Look, the only guarantee of freedom is freedom. You know, it's only through the exercise, the ongoing practice of freedom, that we guarantee and secure freedom going forward." So kind of one issue that raises, and this is the question, is that, well, what kind of politics would be compatible with, you know, such a view of freedom? I mean, so to put it in a slightly different way, but basically saying the same thing, if we have this vision of the open society that as Chandran does, is that compatible with political institutions or political forms such as the state? Okay, and if so, what kinds of political, if not, what kinds of political institutions is it compatible with? Remember, I mean, the open borders debate typically takes place against, in Karen's, for example, against the presumption that we're talking about a world of states, and you have open borders in a world of states. Well, I mean, I think there's a very genuine question about whether, as it were, open borders could possibly work in a world of states. You know, I mean, why would one not expect that we get exactly what we get with freedom of movement within countries, namely that you get wealthy enclaves and ghettos, basically, and a bunch of stuff in between. Okay, so there's no reason to think that wouldn't be reproduced globally. But there are also a whole range of other kind of problems that might lead you to think that open borders would require moving to a different kind of political structure than a world of states. So I'm kind of interested in, if you like, pressing Chandran beyond the dispositional to the question of, well, what kinds of political forms are compatible with that kind of giving full flesh to that disposition. Okay, the second thing I want to raise is that it does strike, and this sort of follows in a way, is it does strike me that there are kind of two strands that are interwoven in the text. The first is the freedom affecting character of immigration controls on both insiders and outsiders. And Chandran has lots of lovely illustrations of that. I mean, you know, when I go to examine a PhD in Oxford, as I did the other week, you know, I am told that if I want to be paid, I have to take my passport so that they confirm that I have a right to work in the UK. This despite the fact that they know I've been, you know, teaching at Southampton for 25 years. You know, so it's just insane. But everything everywhere has become a branch of the Home Office, basically, and that's part of the problem. So that's all really nicely done. But there's another strand which he signals early when raising a kind of critique of membership or nationality, and saying, well, look, we don't want to relate to one another just as members or members to non-members, citizens to aliens. We want to relate to each other as humans. Okay. And one of the themes that runs through the book, including with all the fun he has about the, you know, manifest ways in which those divisions can be, you know, made, and all the different political choices that have been and can be made about how to cut up members and non-members and in various ways. But the other thing that runs through really comes through to the self-determination thing. Okay, which is, if you like, the potent political fiction of state self-determination, of the self-determining sovereign state. And that Chandran wants to kind of undermine that kind of, that political fiction, which is why much of the discussion of philosophical views in the text actually takes a slightly indirect route. So the point is that any political philosophy presupposes a sociology. And so you can either attack it directly by criticizing its philosophical arguments, or you can attack it indirectly by exposing the implausibility of the sociology on which the political philosophy rests. And quite a bit of what Chandran does in the book is exposing the implausibility of, if you like, the sociological assumptions and presuppositions, that the political philosophy is built on and that it's presupposing in articulating its claims. Now, one of the things about the state, the myth of self-determination, the members, non-members distinction, all of that, is that you have this curious feature that the state is both a party to these issues and the judge, basically. So the state both acts as a party to disputes about who should be able to enter or not, but is in the happy position of being the entity that also judges the case. And so I think a good part of Chandran's worries about surveillance, and the other thing that goes along with that is kind of discretionary power, massive use of discretionary power by state agencies in the migration field. I mean, in America and the UK are classic examples of that. Is that some of the interweaving of these two strands basically presents us with a position in which, as it were, state unilateralism is presupposed, or the myth of state unilateralism is presupposed by the people Chandran's attacking. But then there's not an exploration of, if you like, what I would call, say, a kind of Republican view, according to which, as it were, states, being a member of a state, okay, the state may not be able to prevent you from leaving, but you're just as much dominated if no one else lets you in. Okay, it doesn't matter whether it's your state preventing you from leaving or other states, preventing you from entering. You're still subject to that condition of domination. So from a Republican point of view, states have obligations to their citizens to enable them to, as it were, enjoy more mobility options and indeed more citizenship options as a way of making their own citizenship status a non-dominating status. Otherwise, being a citizen is a dominating status, if that's the only thing available to you. Okay? So similarly, the Republican view would move further and say, well, look, there are lots of ways in which control of migration is dominating on migrants, on citizens of states, but also on whole states, particularly in this case in developing world states. So we need to, as it were, get rid of the sort of notion of a unilateral right of states to regulate its borders and move up to some sort of more global or regional or whatever structure, where the problems of the rule of law that Chandran documents that we find within the state, are ameliorated at the very least by being shifted to another level, and where the state is not the judge in its own interests, as it so often is. So part of the point of asking my first question about the disposition of freedom and what political forms it operates in is to say, well, look, open borders might be one way you go with that, but to some kind of, as it were, global regimes of of governance of states might be another way that you go with. That it kind of depends on how the notion of freedom at the level that it can be expressed in law is to be fleshed out. And the thing about the idea of freedom, the spirit of freedom that Chandran wants to cultivate, is that it is itself not expressible in law. It cannot be given legal expression, okay? Precisely because of the sort of subjective experiential dimension that it has to itself. So here again, I'm sort of brought to this kind of question, which is, you know, if we move on from this beautiful kind of meditation that's drawn us to attend to our freedom more fully, where might we move on from that? How might our kind of disposition for freedom be most politically expressed? And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much. Absolutely. I clap too. And so, Chandran, I will let you try and answer those questions, those three questions, and after we'll take the other questions from the audience.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, David. Look, the questions are questions that probably require far more time than I could reasonably take here. So rather than try to answer them individually, let me say a little bit more that gets at, I think, what you're interested in. And I think, you know, you're quite right about the way in which I conceived the book. I decided that I didn't want to write a policy book. I didn't want to write a book that said, look, here's a definition of freedom, and now let's try to, you know, count the different ways in which it's lost or gained under a regime of immigration control. I wanted to say something more like, if you look closely, you'll see that freedom is diminished by the various aspects of the mechanisms of immigration control. Let me tell you how to think through this so you can see what it is that's being lost, as well as later on think also about the justifications that might be offered for this loss. But the emphasis has been on trying to think through the question rather than reach an answer to the question. So I don't offer a defense of open borders. I don't offer any institutional remedies and so on. And I certainly don't offer a neat definition of freedom in the way that, you know, much of the contemporary literature does, by saying, for example, we should understand freedom as non-domination, or freedom as the absence of interference, or freedom, you know, is something that we enjoy when we have independence, and so on. I think all of these efforts try to get at something about freedom, but as you pointed out, I wanted to draw attention to the fact that the freedom that's lost is actually something that's much more personal, something that has to be understood in a sense more phenomenologically than simply in terms of legal categories or capacities for unimpeded movement and so on. So this is what I try to get at in this last chapter. And another aspect of this is that it's very much a moralized understanding of freedom. I'm saying, you know, to think about being free is to think about oneself as a particular kind of person, is to value certain kinds of experiences. It's to value a certain way of being, which not everyone might be happy about or interested in. Okay, but I want to say this is how you should think about things. The other aspect of this then leads to a conclusion which is a little bit sobering, which is that actually this really means that you're going to find freedom in a lot of places you don't expect it, and not a lot of it in a lot of places where you think it's guaranteed. And I give a couple of examples of this. One is the case of the Jews and also the Muslims at different stages who were expelled from Spain. The Jews under Catherine and Ferdinand were given the option: you either convert to Christianity or you leave. Some left and went to Muslim lands where they were welcomed. Others stayed and converted. And you can ask the question, well, who was free? You know, in one way, those who left retained their freedom to live as Jews, albeit as second-class citizens in Muslim lands. But then those who remained in Spain remained in Spain. They continued to live where they'd been. Both enjoyed a certain kind of freedom, and both gave up a certain kind of freedom. Now, of course, one could say, well, look, ideally they would have been able to do either and had that freedom wherever they went. But the point I want to make is that actually the world of freedom is always going to turn out to be a world of trade-offs, because we can't anticipate a world where political institutions are so perfect that they will be completely hospitable to freedom. They will be so completely hospitable that people will feel free wherever they are. They may be limited or not limited in different ways, but it's no good trying to assess this by counting the number of things they can do. You will have to make some judgment about what things matter to them. And once you do that, the counting is really not much use. And then you'll have to get into some philosophical arguments about, well, what kinds of freedoms matter and how much your subjective appreciation of it is what really counts. I'll make one last point about this. The other thing that I didn't mention, but is actually a kind of crucial part of the book, is that freedom is something that we cherish to varying degrees, but control diminishes our enjoyment of it. But it also diminishes something else, because as we make these compromises to accept the limitations on our own freedom, we will inevitably see others who lose their freedom and who aren't so happy about this. And we learn to live with this. In fact, we tell ourselves stories about why this is okay, why it is okay for people to be imprisoned on islands in the Pacific because Australia won't admit them, even though they're found to have, a reasonable case for asylum. Why is it that we put up with the fact that people are in detention camps, are clubbed, are beaten, and so on? We tell stories to, make it possible to live with this. And one of the things I want to say is that, the loss of freedom comes with a kind of loss of character that we have to accept, because in order to live in this way, we have to see things in a certain way. And what I want to ask is that okay? And how far is that okay? That's why the film that I mentioned only briefly, but which is in a sense central to the thesis of this book, is the great German film, The Lives of Others. Because that's what immigration controls ask us to do. They ask us to be indifferent to the lives of others. And even more, they teach us how to do just that. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Chandran, very much. I've got two questions. I'm going to start with Luc and then with Emmanuel. Luc, you can take the floor.
You're muted. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. You got me now? Okay, thank you. So Chandran, I'm fully on board with the positive thesis, I think, about immigration controls restricting freedom. I'm persuaded, but I guess one of the thoughts that I've had, and I'm sure you thought about this, is if the arguments for immigration controls are so bad, how did we get into this mess? Right? If they don't hold up, it's seriously worth reflecting how so much time and effort globally has gone into creating this system, which is in so many ways so counterproductive. How did it arise? Then there's a question, of course, how do we perhaps start to dismantle it? But in a way, it's like you've got these great arguments to get against immigration, but my worry is that it's arisen for actually quite irrational reasons, for bad reasons, and therefore, in a sense, arguing against it is in a way like you're never going to hit your target, because your method here is like, who's going to we are all an audience of the converted. I doubt anyone in this gathering disagrees with you, right? But how has this come to pass? Well, I'm always struck by it. Hobbes says the natural seeds of religion are fear and curiosity, right? Now, it seems like the natural seeds of immigration regimes are fear, if you like. The curiosity part is what leads us to be open, which is what you recommend. This is why, as you say, when people get in, you kind of can't stop some interactions happening. But the other side of it is the fear. And the thing is that this has been a huge vote winner for democratic politicians generally. So you're sort of talking some of the time, at least, as if the state is imposing all this, but the dynamics by which it comes about are, people, democratic politicians outbidding one another with, promises to keep people out, protect the locals, and so on. And this is what's kind of driving the whole thing. And the problem is also, once you've created these very powerful vested interests, civil servants, politicians, you create these regimes, you then create vested interest in continuing them. You give somebody power, they don't want to give it up. And furthermore, a related problem is that the people imposing and administering these regimes, the people legislating them, the civil servants administering them, they don't bear any of the costs themselves, or at least not in any immediate direct way. They are immune, really insulated from, like, they're literally not going to feel it when somebody can't bring their husband or wife in. They're not connected to that situation. So this all seems to me to have arisen for, also irrational reasons, which then become self-perpetuating and are partly at the very root of the logic of democracy itself. The only way I can see to do this is to make similarly, in a way, irrational appeals in trying to persuade people, not so much give them facts, but indeed feed them a story about openness, which is more inspiring than the fear that is motivating the exclusion. But what that story would be, I don't know. You just said immigration controls ask us to be indifferent to the lives of others, but I think actually here's maybe one point where I would disagree with you. It's not indifference that's driving immigration controls. It's something like the psychic pleasure of exercising power in excluding others vicariously. It's this psychoanalytic, if you like, angle that I would push here, that politicians appeal to electorates by, well, at least we can keep that lot out. And you can feel good because they can't come in, and this is actually a positive pleasure. It's not an indifference at all that's motivating this. And it gives you this illusion of control, because I agree with you that there isn't really control. Not the really scary thing about reality is no one's in charge. And the most we can do is sort of surf the waves. We can't actually steer the world. We can make things maybe go better or worse, but the world's going to go around whether we like it or not. And you don't have ultimate control. And so, realizing that and thinking, well, if I don't have control, then openness is the best policy. Absolutely right. Completely agree. But I just think that there's this whole side to your argument of how we got here and how we get out of it that I'm not hearing, that I would love to hear you talk about. And the rationality and democracy seem to me to be key themes here. Sorry, it's a bit long, but...
No, I think that's an important question and an important point as well. So I think you're quite right that it's come about in a sense by accident. No one has devised this regime. It's not like, there was a Bretton Woods, a meeting in Bretton Woods where we established the financial structure of the, of global economic transactions. No, these things came about piecemeal for different sorts of reasons, and then before we knew it, you add a little bit of democratic politics. You add a little bit of cultural anxiety in places like Australia. You add some racial fear, which is a big part in Australia for expanding its institutions, and suddenly you get a kind of international regime. You have a crisis because of refugee flows after the First World War. This brings about further changes, but it's also worth noting that the whole of human history is a going back and forth with respect to the control of people's movements as well as their their identities. And even if you look at the 20th century, we just took, let's say, American history of immigration control. It goes back and forth. There are many respects in which it's a lot freer than it was before. It's no longer the case that if an American woman marries an African, she loses her nationality. It's no longer the case, and this was only, I think, in 1983 that it was finalized, that an English woman who married a foreigner and had children was, no longer unable to pass on her British nationality. In the past, only men could pass on their nationality. Lots of things have gone back and forth. So my sense is that there's no way that we can, in fact, reform the institutional structure wholesale, because it's too big. As you say, no one's in control. Even if we got everybody who is a political leader together and said, let's fix this, we couldn't. But I think it is possible to make piecemeal changes. And, with so many things that ultimately get reformed, what happens is a different kind of event altogether changes the landscape. Okay, if Britain hadn't joined the EU, how would the Irish question have played out? Possibly very differently. I mean, I'm not saying we didn't need the Good Friday Accords. But how would it have been had Britain not been a part of the EU? Completely different set of circumstances. To some extent, a part of the question was solved by other economic, social, and political developments. So I think, from the point of view of the theorists, the thing to do is actually, to seek understanding rather than try to come up with policy prescriptions in the large. Plenty of small policy prescriptions to be made, and there I think the kinds of arguments I'm making can be useful. If you're just looking at practical effect, I think I could go and say, look, do you realize that 20,000 people a year are too poor to bring their husbands or wives into the country? Surely that's not right. There could be a relaxation of that. Things do change, but not all at once.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. And Emmanuel, please.
Hello, thanks first for the talk, which was really fascinating. I was wondering what was specific about the case you make about immigration, when there are plenty of other areas of our lives in which we see control applying, for instance, eligibility to social policy and social schemes and relief schemes, or most aspects of the management of citizens. And beyond the management of citizens, the management of individuals as customers, for instance. So I was wondering why you chose. I mean, if you were really making a case, if your book, which I unfortunately haven't read yet, was mostly about immigration or mostly about the loss of freedom implied by social controls, and I'm wondering if the same kind of argument can be made about, well, with most post 9/11 legislation in the Western world, and indeed beyond the Western world itself. And one of the things I really liked about your presentation was the fact that you were not restricted to this time frame, but that you looked back to the whole of the 20th century, and you had also a global perspective. But I was really wondering what the key argument was about freedom or immigration.
Yes, you're absolutely right that in a way the institution of immigration is the vehicle through which I want to present a certain argument about freedom. And you're absolutely right. Immigration control is not the only way in which freedom is diminished. It's not the only occasion for mass surveillance, for the intrusion into the lives of citizens. And so what I actually say in the book at the end of it, when I take up this question, I take it up in the form of a common objection made to my argument, which is that, well, we're used to being under surveillance and monitored and subject to the laws and required to hold documentation in all of these other areas. Why worry about immigration? And I want to say that maybe the problem should be thought about the other way around. We've gotten so used to being monitored, surveilled, limited, prevented, and so on, that we just think of this as one more thing. Whereas in a different set of circumstances, maybe we would be more worried about immigration control if we weren't already so controlled in so many other ways. So what I want to say is, maybe the very fact that people are saying, well, it's just one more control, is a reason to look not just at immigration control, but actually at the whole plethora of controls to which we're subject. Now, clearly, in any complex society, there have to be laws, regulations. We have to have some way of being, confident about what our fellow residents are doing. We can't be so completely free that we do whatever we like. But nonetheless, there's also, a question of to what extent are we then limited and restricted because of that. And I want to say much more so than is really needed. In fact, although I don't advance this argument in this particular book, I want to say that we are actually far too cavalier about our attitude to the loss of our freedoms in so many other ways. This is just one respect in which we've found ourselves diminished. But in a sense, one freedom at a time.
Christine would like to add something.
Yeah, actually, I just want to ask and see if Chandran would then second what I think of as the kind of Tocquevillian soft despotism point, that if we are so entrapped in this web of tiny regulations, that we also, it also erodes our capacities to be free. Both we no longer recognize that we're, caught in this little bitty web, as Tocqueville's words for it, but that this also has detrimental consequences on our abilities to be free, to exercise those muscles, if you will.
Yeah, very much so. And as you certainly know, I do talk a little bit about Tocqueville at the end of the book, and particularly look at the the invocation of the idea of self-despotism. Oh, sorry, of soft despotism. And I guess the critical point for me here, which I've already mentioned, is that to be free, I've come to think as a result of writing this book, more so than I appreciated before, is to be a particular kind of person. So one of the things that has to be asked, and I don't really address this question fully in the book, is that, well, why be this kind of a person? Why care about freedom? What's so valuable or important, worthwhile about living as a free human being? And how free do you need to be? I think this is actually the kind of question that I think political philosophy should address much more. It tends to focus, I think, now primarily on institutional questions. You know, what kinds of permissions and prohibitions should there be, and what kinds of mechanisms should be in place to, you know, to make society well ordered, and who's owed what by whom. And I don't want to say these are unimportant questions, but ultimately I think the real question is, you know, how should one live? Okay, and I want to say I think, you know, one should live as a free person. So then the question is, well, what exactly is that, and why is that so important? I don't think I've got a really good answer to that yet, but maybe sometime.
Thank you. I'm going to give the floor to Marie-Pierre, and then I will finish because I'm going to give myself the floor because I've got a question following this one. Marie-Pierre, up to you.
Thank you for your presentation. It's very inspiring. I research on immigration in the United States, and in the context of my master's students, we do discuss immigration today in the United States. And your discussion on, you know, immigration versus freedom in the case of the United States is very interesting, because there seems to be a dilemma in the US between freedom as individual freedom, my personal freedom, versus freedom as the greater good. And so how do you relate to that in terms of your philosophy?
Yeah, I think in the United States, there are probably a few different ideas that are there in the background when people debate freedom, whether they're talking about immigration or they're talking about other issues when freedom is appealed to. I think some of that is a reflection of, you know, American history and political culture, a culture of rights where certain sorts of rights are taken to be especially important. And so I think for some people, the appeal to freedom is in a sense not just an appeal to their own personal freedoms, but it's also an appeal to the need to protect a certain kind of way of living, a certain kind of set of institutions that they think is central. So, you know, they might think that you know, central to being free is you know, being someone who's not overly taxed, who's got the freedom to have his own property, who's got the right to bear arms, and you know, who's got a range of rights that are guaranteed or strongly protected by the Constitution and so on. I think when people think in these terms, then the claims of others who want to emphasize different freedoms becomes much less convincing to them, because I think for them different freedoms are what matter. So I think to engage in this argument just in terms of freedom is actually quite difficult, because I think everywhere people have different things in mind when they hear the word freedom. And not just because philosophers have parsed it out in various ways. I think actually, oddly, I've come to think more and more that the way that philosophers talk about freedom just doesn't resonate at all with the way that people think about it in everyday life. It's too abstract. It's too difficult to connect with. So I think people think about freedom both in personal terms, how, you know, it makes them feel, and then in terms of the beliefs and commitments they've got because of the society they're in. And I think these two things will, come into tension in the United States in the way that I've mentioned, but I think in different ways. I imagine that in France, for example, freedom is clearly very important. It's, it's got a long history of appealing to it, but I suspect that what resonates with people in France institutionally is quite different from what resonates in the United States. And I think also, the personal sense of what's the kind of freedom that matters most is different for a French person than it is for someone in the United States. And this, I think, would need, a lot more sociological teasing out than I'm capable of offering, even if I had a lot more time than this.
Thank you. And thank you, Marie-Pierre. And so perhaps it's a concluding comment, but I mean, I was very pleased that David mentioned that it was almost a spiritual book, a meditation with humor, because in fact, I thought that, I've read half of it because it arrived late, but I also read the wonderful epilogue, Imagine If You Needed a Visa to Fall in Love, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. And that's something I want to say is that it's a very elegant book, but I was thinking reading you, Chandran, that it was both, I think, perhaps the work of a global citizen, and it's also the work of a book of maturity in which you can actually see in some sort of way it is infused with Hayek's understanding of liberty, but also to a certain extent, when I was reaching and listening to you, I was wondering to what extent it was not infused also with Oakeshott's refusal of rationalism, and that in the end, if you refuse to give us political prescriptions, I was wondering if this was not the point precisely for us in some sort of way to work it out. Of course, in a sort of meditative sort of way, but if this was not, in fact, coming out from your life reading all those authors who eventually have literally infused in you.
Mm-hmm. I think you're very accurate in both the observations. Firstly, clearly I've lived in many different parts of the world, although, funnily enough, I only hold one nationality, which is Australian, for various reasons I won't go into now. But yes, I have lived in many different parts of the world for extended periods of time. I've lived in Britain for about 16 years in total, in the US for about 7, in Malaysia for 8, in Singapore for 2.5, Australia for about 30. So I'm just looking around for the next stopping point. You're right also that I have been shaped by the people I've read. Hayek is important. Oakeshott's also very important, although he doesn't appear quite as explicitly, except towards the end, when I draw attention to a distinction he makes between civil association and enterprise association, familiar to the Oakeshottians here, obviously. But one of the things I particularly liked about the distinction Oakeshott makes here, which he does in the context of the third part of On Human Conduct, where he's analyzing the modern European state, is that what he says is that, there are these two tendencies in the European tradition. One is to have a kind of state that's what he calls a civil association, where the rules are very, very minimal, to put it sort of slightly inaccurately, and people aren't engaged in a common enterprise, but they interact with one another simply, as people who, share a civil association. But there's also the conception of the state as an enterprise association, where the state has, in fact, turned into something which is almost like a project, a shared project or a collective project. And he says that, in the history of modern Europe, states have moved between these two poles. You never get one thing or the other in pure form. And I always thought that was a very insightful observation because it's generalizable across the world in the sense that every state, every country is in a sense a product and an ongoing exemplar of different things that exist in tension with one another. And at any one moment we might lurch or slide in one direction or the other. And I think this is simply, a part of the human condition, which isn't any reason not to make arguments in the context, but it is a good reason not to think that somehow you're going to grab a hold of the entire thing and sort it. It's also why I don't think there's actually much use to be gained, or at least not as much as philosophers think, from setting out an ideal and then using that as the basis for thinking about, the nature of your society and the directions in which you'd like it to move. Not entirely useless, but I think of much more limited value than philosophers think. At least some philosophers. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, I guess that all of us will join me in clapping and thanking Chandran and David. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, as well for.
Really a treat having you all and having you both to discuss this wonderful book. And so I would you like to say perhaps a last word, both of you, and if not, we can close this team session.
Well, I just want to say thank you very much, Catherine, for inviting me on and having all these people come to listen and learn about the book. So I hope it'll, gain a wider readership. But perhaps I'll at this point turn it over to David as well, because I've dominated the post-presentation discussion.
Yes, well, I want to say thanks too, because I was one of the readers of the book for the press. I'm not kind of allowed to, write an official book review of it or anything like that. So it was nice to have a chance to sort of, indicate to Chandran some of the sort of value that I found in this really beautifully written book, but also some of the kind of questions that it left me with, given my concerns, which are not entirely the same as Chandran's concerns. So enabled that I hope it sort of helped people who hadn't read the book a little bit get a sense of it, and I would urge them all to go and read it. It's a book that really should be read.
I agree, absolutely. And so on those words, I would say that there is a good thing in having a Teams or Zoom or whatever, is that we are on different continents, but we can all be brought together, and that in some sort of way, however much I miss not seeing you and not having the post-afternoon late drink and dinner in Paris, I do say that I hope I'll see most of you soon. And next time in our research seminar, next December, in fact, Jan, do you want to say a word perhaps very quickly?
Yes, we are going, so normally I think it will be an in-person seminar, it will be a physical one. I hope that in the meantime we have the possibility to maybe to make it an hybrid seminar, because I really appreciated the fact that today we were able to draw so many people. So I think it was it's a very good thing. So we're going to have a historian of economics, Cléo Chassonnery-Zaygouche, who's from the Crash Center at Cambridge University, and she's specialist on the history of the economics discrimination, and she's also a specialist on how economists have worked as part of courts in using economic knowledge to talk about economic discrimination. So I think it's going to be very interesting, and I hope that I see some of you there. Thank you.
Absolutely, and so thank you very much, and Lissel Quiros, who couldn't come, Emmanuel, Yann, and I, thank you all, and hopefully see you very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.